Are in-person conferences worth it? Is there any value for podcasters to attend in-person conferences and events apart from getting FOMO from social media? We've all been there. And are offline events the secret to growing your influence in podcast downloads? I'm breaking down this and so much more, but specifically how I consistently get a 10 to 25% download increase weeks after these events take place. In case we haven't met, hi, I'm Anna Xavier. I'm a podcast marketing expert, and here at the podcast space, I teach you all the different ways you can strategically grow your podcast, your influence without overwhelm, and stand out in the online space. So let's dive into this week's episode of the podcast space. First things first, thanks to Dr. Julie for suggesting this topic. I've been planning to talk about this for a while because I've been attending events since 2020, professionally as, the founder of the podcast space since the company was founded. And I've attended 5 podcast movements all over the US. And this is the biggest podcast conference here in the US. And one podcast conference in Portland, Oregon, which I also spoke at. And then one tech conference, 2 events for female entrepreneurs, and a handful of meetups and informal leadership events. Most recently, the podcast show in London. And what I'm going to be talking about is also not only the strategies that I use to grow my influence through these events, how I improve the quality of my network, but also if you are an introvert. I'm going to be talking about how to survive these, how to start having conversations with people, even if you feel like you are not prone to those, and also covering some of the biggest pitfalls that I see and that you should absolutely avoid if you want to use these podcast conferences to grow your influence. So let's start with the first one. Are in-person events worth it for podcasters who take the show seriously? In a nutshell, yes, they're absolutely worth it. They're magical. And I'm not just saying this because I'm an extrovert, but you have to pick them intentionally. And all the things that I'm going to be discussing in this episode are going to be based on podcasting events, but also industry events. All right, so there are 4 specific opportunities for in-person events that I want to talk about: networking opportunities, education, marketing, and influence or impact of your work. And of course, for some people, they will see more returns on specific ones than others. So let's start with networking opportunities. When you're in these events, you're able to maximize your time and meet people who are normally out of reach. So think about all the people that you admire, especially podcasters that attend these events, whether they're speaking, whether they're attending for their own benefits as well, like they will be there. So it's just not as awkward to engage with someone because you know that everyone there is supposed there to be meeting other people. So right off the bat, people are more welcoming to meeting other people. So if you're trying to get more kind of like rubbing elbows with other people, you should absolutely attend these events. And then number 2 is education. The first events I attended, I was really in there for the education. I'm like, I want to learn all the things. Even as an expert, I feel like there's always stuff that I either maybe forgot about, or those are blind spots, or just a different take on something that may be useful for my clients. So something to pay attention is really information overwhelm. Sometimes when you're at events, it feels like there's so much information happening. And this is like literally one of the attendees' main complaints. It's like you come out of this event super inspired, and then you get home and you look at the bunch of notes you have and you're like, oh my God, where do I start? So to me, my top tip is really getting one action item per session, but really getting realistic about the execution of the advice given at the conference. So you want to make sure the execution isn't required by like 5 people if you're a team of 1, or it requires a big budget, or the timeline is really long and you're looking to get results in the short term. And just a caveat that I have here is that honestly, sometimes take these presentations with a grain of salt. I've been in presentations where I was like, oh my gosh, like this is really great stuff. And I've been in presentations where I was like, this doesn't check out. You know what I mean? Like when you're looking and you're like, maybe it's just me that I'm an expert in the field and I go, well, this could not be used as a blank statement, because some people will say, hey, I tried this to grow my show and it really worked. And when you look into the specifics, you're kind of like, well, it worked because it's a very specific situation, not necessarily because it's replicable. So just make sure that whatever is being shared like really applies to what you're doing, and have like a healthy dose of skepticism in some things, because sometimes you don't want to try something to a T, try and replicate it, and then it doesn't work. And you're like, oh, my stuff is wrong. Maybe what was shared on stage sometimes isn't accurate. But, I don't want to delve into that. Now, in terms of marketing, talking about the event, documenting it while you're being there is really, really important. And you're going to be probably rolling your eyes and you're like, Anna, is attending the event not enough? Well, let me just say it like this. I had so many people, and again, I document the events in a very specific way. Because I have a background in social media and I used to work in the nonprofit world, doing these events, I was actually documenting them for social media. So there's a part of that I brought with me into the podcast space. And I always think about like when I'm attending, I want to bring people along. And normally I'm trying to give takeaways from the sessions. And again, kind of like one takeaway or things that I know my audience will appreciate. But so frequently, people come to me and they say, hey, I've been following you since you went to X event, or I really appreciate you sharing these with us. Like I'm taking so much knowledge as well as getting FOMO, but it's just a great way to give back to your community while you're there and building those relationships with the ones that aren't there. But really using these events as marketing for yourself to show that you are part of the community is invaluable because take a second to think about this. When you're looking around in your industry or maybe other podcasters, think about the amount of people who are actually attending these events and making time. And sometimes you don't have to go to the big ones, but making the time to do offline events takes some energy and time and money. So by you going to these events and saying that you're going, it really showcases how dedicated you are to these podcasts and to your industry. Also, let's not forget two very important things. One, when you go to these events, you tend to feel really inspired. So it will positively impact the quality of your work, just the creativity levels in general. Honestly, you will be amazed at how much attending events like these can energize you. And then on the other hand is the fact that when you're meeting with other creators, these conversations, whether they're by podcast listeners or by fellow peers in the industry, they will inspire you to come up with different episode ideas or pinpoints you may not have seen, or these conversations can inspire a whole podcast series or help you realize maybe some blind spots in your marketing and help you realize that perhaps you have not been talking about this, or maybe a fellow peer can look at what's not working on your show, or maybe they tell you how much they appreciate something specific that you're doing and that you may have forgotten about. Now, moving into influence and impact of your work. People during these events come out of the woodwork, and people who watch your social media, people who subscribe to your newsletter, people who listen to your podcast. This is where it's key to promote that you're going to the event and to invite people to say, hey, join me there, say hello, book time. If you were on my newsletter and if you were on my social media for the past few weeks, to be honest, for the past month, you know that I've been talking about how I'm going to the podcast show in London. And one is because I used to live in London. And so in a way, it's kind of like, hey, like people in my industry, like I'm going to be there. Like I would love to see you as well. But at the same time, I know that a big chunk of my audience, because I'm Portuguese, they were also going to attend the event. So making them aware that I'm going is such a great way to have people who may have been following me for a while to feel like, one, they already know one person if they didn't know anyone else. And then second, that when they're attending this event, they know that I'm already willing to talk to people. So it really helps because, again, like these events can be really hard for beginners. So something else that will happen is that you realize that industries and kind of like your city circles, they're smaller than you think. Your first event may feel like really awkward and you may feel like everybody has a buddy and everyone knows everyone else and it's very cliquey. But just remember that everyone has been where you're at now if this is one of your first events, right? You cannot feel like you know people if you don't go. And the more you start really looking at preparing, like you just realize that you don't have to leave all of the pressure for the day of the event itself. You can really start building the influence and the impact of your work before going. And something that will happen is that as you prepare yourself to go to this event, and I'll talk about the prepping in a second, it's that you're really starting to figure out when you're in these events, and especially if you've been visible. Like, honestly, if you are doing a podcast and you never share your podcast and you never promote it and you don't engage with other people, then this is going to be a bit difficult. But I was just at the London show. I don't know why I keep saying the London show in conversations. Is the podcast show in London? Jeez. So anyway, when I'm at this event, 2 listeners of the show that I knew already were going to be there, they messaged me ahead of time. They say, hey, I'm going to be at the show. I'd love to see you. It's like, great, let's meet. And then there was another person that I wasn't expecting to meet and that I met there. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so great. So I got to hear from their mouth the impact of my work. And I know I can hear you already. Well, Anna, you've been doing this for a while. Of course, you're going to have people. Well, you really never know. I'm talking about, this was the podcast show in London, but I attended events that were tech events here in Dallas where that happened as well. But when you put yourself out there and you talk about going to these events and you really are visible, you are honestly only really able to see about 10% of the impact that you have and the visible outcomes of your work. So when we put our podcast out there and our content out there, you never really know who's watching, who's looking on social media, who's listening to your show. So that's why it's important to just have these conversations in real time, because sometimes people may not feel like they can send you a DM or email you, but they will come to you in an in-person event. You're there, so they'll talk to you. Now, moving into what potentially is one of the most important things when attending in-person events, the prepping. And even before the event starts, sometimes organizers create a Facebook group or Discord or an app. So before going to these events, in order to optimize your presence, in order to get those downloads, really follow these steps. And these are so simple, yet so many people don't do them. Number 1, if you are able, like, this is going to be more geared toward like an app. If the event has an app, make sure that you are looking at the profile ahead of time. So get a professional / like recognizable photo. Do not upload a selfie. Create something that looks like you right now and that people can recognize you, because I had multiple people come to me at events and ahead of the conference itself starting, they messaged me. They went, oh my God, Anna, so excited that you're going. Would love to meet. Or, Anna, I follow you already on LinkedIn. Would love to meet in person. Or people who don't know me and they're like, hey, Anna, I really like what your description read. I would love to meet in person. So that brings me to the next step, which is fill out the description that they give you with keywords and information about you. So make sure that you have not only, like, you don't have just like podcast producer or, like host of whatever podcast. Tell them what the podcast is about. Tell them things that they connect with you. And if they were to search for keywords on the app, your name would show up. In fact, I even created an Instagram video about this, which I will embed in the show notes, because I just thought, like, not that many people do this. So moving into the next one. So including descriptions and keywords and including some information that people can resonate with is important. But as well is getting links to your social media, your website, and if possible to your podcast. This is really where the magic will happen, because you can download the app for the event, but if you don't follow the person on social media, that's it. Like, it's out, right? So make sure that your profile does have a way for them to connect with you. So have the places where you're actually active. So in my case is Instagram and LinkedIn. And again, if you can make it as easy as possible for them to find your podcast, do it. And just think about this for a second. When you're going to an event, or when you're going to, like, if you're part of a group and the person doesn't have a photo or a description, how inclined are you to talk to them? You're not, right? So just proves that having those 2 basic things really helps people engage with you. And this is the key. When you're beefing up your profile, you're basically maximizing the opportunities for them to go and learn about you at their own time. You don't need to pitch your podcast to them. They can go and check it out, right? So another one is when you're looking at the attendee list, if you recognize any names, send invites to connect or set meeting times. And the app is really where some people will go back to once the event is done. And so if you started like messaging people on the app, they will like be able to go back to it. Think about how many people you add on an event, right? And so my friend Lloyd George, he actually does an even better job. He will message the person and he will like, hey, so-and-so, it was great meeting you at the event. We talked about this, and this, looking forward to staying connected. So he does that. And I'm like, oh my God, that's brilliant. Because then you can remember the person and the conversation you had. So if you're doing a follow-up, then you will be able to remember what they talked about. And so something else that I like doing is if the event has a hashtag, I will remember to use it ahead of the event, because sometimes building up to it, you will start going into the social media of the events. And so people will start recognizing some handles, and not that many people comment on it. So you can get people to know about you, your podcast, and your brand even before the event starts. So that's such an easier way to do it. And now, of course, if you want to get business cards to the events, get them. I try to not give as many business cards. I use the apps and I only give them if someone really asks me and they say like, I really want a business card, so I remember. I try to actually collect business cards or take screenshots right after I meet someone and I'm like, okay, I want to follow up with this person. So just remembering that some of these things, like getting business cards, it's not necessarily that important if you add the person on LinkedIn or if you make a lasting impression. All right, if you have a book, stickers, or merch, take them with you. Like I had so many lovely encounters with people and they gave me their stickers or their books and I was able to read them. So that also was helpful. So if you have like a mini guide for your podcast or something like that, that is something that is going to help people remember you. And now this is like something that I think it's such an underrated strategy to stand out in events and help people remember you and your podcast. Think about your outfits. And no, you don't need to go on a shopping spree. I never buy anything for conferences. I just take my favorite outfits. Of course, like they look fun. I feel confident. And that's the thing about these events. You have to make a lasting impression. And it's making something that is making you recognizable, like wearing your branding colors or themed accessories. Something that I will wear is my microphone earrings, and they're quite tiny. And so what's funny, though, is that someone will come to me, start talking to me, and like maybe 5 minutes into the conversation, they'll go, oh my God, you have microphone earrings. That is so cute. Or then they'll go, oh my gosh, I had to come and talk to you because I love your outfit or whatever it is, right? Like, this is the best tip if you are an introvert. Wear something that will help people come to you and start a conversation with you. This is honestly one of the strategies that I will always use. Now, a few other tips for introverts. I think reaching out on the app before the event is easier because then you can talk to someone, learn a little bit more about them, and it just helps you with making it to the event, making it less stressful. And then butting up. If you can't go with someone else, by you saying that you're going to the event, you could have people reach out to you and say, hey, I'm going to the event as well. It would be great to see you. So instead of thinking like, let's say an event is like 3 days, you know that at some point, for portions of the day, you're going to have someone else that you can talk to, and it really helps. And then last but not least, practice your pitch. And this is really for everyone. Think about how you're promoting a podcast. Can you have your pitch down to under 30 seconds? What is it that your podcast does for people? What do you do for people? But really thinking about this is helpful when you're in an event and you know exactly, you have your pitch in the top of your tongue and you just go. Not that many people have the confidence to say something like that, to go and say, hey, this is what my podcast is. This is what it does for people. So that will help people remember you. All right, number 2, is it worth the money? It kind of depends. If you're going just for the education, you may be disappointed because let's say the education is something that you already know or something, it may not be worth it. So if you determine that you want to go, really think about this in the long game, in the long term. And I had someone ask me at the conference in London, hey, what is the ROI of coming to these conferences? And I didn't have kind of a staple answer because it really is about the connections that you make. And I was talking about as well, like in the marketing, like saying that you're standing out, and that's not measurable. But I will say that the connections that I've made and I've stayed in touch with, they remember me 6 months, 12 months, 2 years later. And so I will say conferences are great to talk to people that I've been wanting to talk for a while, or people who I never thought I would meet and they were there and it was great. And then brands will keep you in mind. If you want to increase your engagement with brands or maybe sponsorships, those can happen. So let me give you 4 different situations that have happened at conferences to give you clear examples of what happened. So when I attended the Podcast Movement Conference here in Dallas, I met a podcaster, and within 3 months, I secured a $1,500 consultation work with them. So again, it happened within 3 months. It didn't happen immediately, but it's also about the follow-up, right? So another thing was that I met a brand last year, and I've been in talks to work together. A few things didn't work out, and they had their own schedule. But again, we met again, and they say, hey, let's really pin down a brand collaboration. And again, I can't talk about that just yet, but you'll see it. But yeah, these are things that happen at a conference because even though they may follow you, they get to speak to you in real life. You get to actually like vibe and get the energy and all of that. Something else that I was able to do was to be invited to speak at a podcast that is on the top 1% because the host, even though they followed me on LinkedIn, they actually met me at the conference by accident. And they're like, hey, Anna, I've been thinking about having you on my podcast. And it just happened that I didn't have a chance to invite you. I would love to have you. Like, oh my God, of course. So I want to make a side note as well about the things that are in the works that you have no idea about. So I had people reach out to me months after the conferences and they said, hey, Anna, I really loved your recap of the event. A few things that you actually mentioned on social media while you were there really helped me grow my podcast. And I was like, oh my gosh, that was great. I had no idea that this person was implementing. My impact increased just by me sharing what happened there. So last but not least, this is how I use events to grow my downloads, how I consistently get 10 to 25% download increase even weeks after the event. All right, number 1, I am very intentional about the conferences that I attend, and I pick places where I know my ideal listener hangs out. And when I'm talking to people, number 2, I try to listen more than I speak. And the reason for that is that, number 3, I don't force them to subscribe to my podcast, and basically I tailor the pitch to the person I'm speaking. So I'm trying to weave whatever they told me in this conversation into episodes that I have or clients that I've served. And so that's when you can pitch your podcast and say, hey, you told me that, I don't know, maybe that they are a speaker. And you go, hey, actually, I did a podcast episode on how to maximize your reach through the podcast. So actually, you should totally check it out. And then if the person is already pulling their phone out, then you help them find your show. If they're like, oh, okay, like don't force it. But yeah, like there's so many ways that you can weave in kind of in real-time conversations and maximize subscriptions. And I had this happen more times than not, where you have to really tune into their body language. And you have to make them feel like they matter. This is number 4. This isn't a numbers game. This is about 2 humans talking, and this is something that we all do, right? Like we've all been to conferences where it just feels like they're almost like in a race against themselves to try to speak to as many people as possible. The idea is that we are really building relationships, that people connect to us, and they had the best time talking to us. And so if they connect with what we do and we are really doing a good job at pitching them how our podcast is the solution to their problem, it's going to really help them remember us. And I had people message me a few days after the conference and they said, hey, Anna, I'm listening to your show right now. I'm really loving this. Thank you so much. People will come to you after if they really felt like you make them feel important and they mattered in the time you spent together. This is not the time to be sleazy car salesman and like try to like throw numbers at them and try to just like being really intense. This is not the time for that. And then potentially what is one of the most important things is to really think about, and if you're a listener of the show, you know how I talk about this all the time, and that is the path of subscription. So basically the path of the listener, and to make it as frictionless as possible. So if we can have, our website on the app, or just maybe have it on our business card, a QR code where people can subscribe to the show right away, it's going to be really, really helpful. And then make sure that you do almost like an audit to your social media and your websites. So very often we create like a link in bio or a profile with links, and we forget to go and revise it. And maybe we had a course going on or an email list that is like not active anymore. Maybe we didn't even add the podcast at some point to our link in bio. And so when people follow us, they can access this. And I know these are kind of like basic things, but the amount of times I met someone and it's almost like a treasure map trying to find the link to their podcast because there's just no direct links anywhere or contact information. It's silly. So it happens more frequently than you would think. So make sure that that is added to your checklist. So if you were a speaker, you will be able to get people to follow up with you. So being a speaker, again, is even more important that on your documentation, when you have your presentation, you always talk about like, hey, I'm the host of the whatever podcast. And if you have at the end, maybe a landing page where people can go and subscribe to your podcast, or they will be added into your email sequence. That's when they can go and subscribe to the show. I have not spoken at a ton of events to say that is something that has kind of always worked, but for sure, being on the app from the beginning, having a thorough profile, having all of these things when engaging with people, and selecting conferences that really are about my ideal listener, these will be the things that make the most difference in the long term to get your downloads. And again, you can look at my download numbers and they consistently match after the event. Normally is within the first week that I see that spike. And then for, continually, I have that push of new listeners. So it does, the analytics do back up the strategies that I'm talking about. It's just like, it would be really weird that all of these spikes happen as I'm going to these conferences. So it's a consequence of these actions. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on these. Have you tried these before? Have you seen growth on your podcast episodes, in your podcast reach overall, on your social media? Are you going to be implementing some of these? What suggestions do you have? I would love to add them to the page as well if you have any awesome ones. So make sure that you go into thepodcastspace.com/podcast. This is episode 73. Thank you again to Dr. Julie for suggesting this question. And so, of course, if you want to grow your influence, your organic downloads, and if you want to make sure that your podcast presence is optimized so that you're making the most impact for your community for today and tomorrow, let me know. I have a range of instant access courses, coaching, and many guides that you can access at thepodcastspace.com. I've been Anna Xavier, and this was The Podcast Space. And just ending this episode with my invitation as usual to remind you to create content that's imperfect but moves you forward. I'll see you in the next episode.